welcome Flip Clock fans. You're looking at the inside workings of a Seth Thomas catalog number 797 Model E039-005. I did do a video of this a while back, but since that time the clock's been sitting on a shelf and it actually stopped working. And it came up, someone else was talking about a clock that has a mechanism which I think is probably the same, and they were having trouble with theirs. And I thought, well, let's talk about this, about how this works and about what might have been the problem. So I do believe that I finally got this fixed. So what we've got here, and we talked about Seth Thomas, which here says Division of General Time Corporation. Now I do have a video out about the history of Seth Thomas, because I'm just saying it's the truth. A lot of people get it wrong. They'll say, well, General Time bought Seth Thomas, and that's not true. Anything that says Division of General Time Corporation, it means it predates 1970. That's when, in 1970, people again will say, well, Tally Industries bought Seth Thomas in 1968 or whatever. That's not true at all. There was a hostile takeover, and they took over General Time Corporation and proceeded to run it into the ground. There's a story, I've got a story about that, about what happened. They did do a buyback in 1988, so you might see General Time show up again, but because this is an older clock, we know that this predates 1970, because as soon as 1970 hit, they took all their labels and put Tally Industries on there. So what's going on with this clock? Well, it's a battery clock, as you can see. And so what's the mechanism? Any battery clock's got to have a means of moving the clock. Well, this happens to be a tick-tock clock, so you can see the inner workings there going on. And if you look here, we see that it says General Time. So it says 1 joule unadjusted. What does that mean? It means that at some point in here there is a joule that's got a hole drilled in it so that the arbor, the metal post, rides inside that joule instead of onto the metal, which could cause it to get wobbly from wear. So it makes your clock more valuable. The joule isn't a precious stone that you could take out and sell or anything like that. It just makes the clock more valuable. It says unadjusted. What does that mean? Well, in clock world, or in watch world mostly, an adjusted watch means that the time mechanism has been adjusted to work in a lot of different directions, like you would need for a wristwatch. Well, you wouldn't need a clock to be adjusted, would you? So it's not unusual to see it say unadjusted on these. It's actually not unusual for the mechanism to say no joules, but this one happens to have 1 joule. So I just think that's curious. So how does this thing work? Well, the key here is this reed switch. So a reed switch is a glass-filled tube that has 2 pieces of metal barely not touching. As soon as you bring a magnet close to those, and there's our magnet, as soon as that magnet comes close to that reed switch, it closes those 2 together, which in this case takes the negative here, which is attached here, and pulls it over to here and sends the current up to the motor. The motor turns, which will advance the clock, and at the same time wind this spring. So that spring in there, which is winding, is how this is unloading that spring tension. So the clock is technically a self-winding clock, and that's what's going on. So as it also turns, it also resets this bar. So at some point there's a bar on the other side here that will drop and get out of the way and allow this to move forward. And then it touches that, sets off the motor, and then you go on and on. So I just think that's really cool. So what happened and why did this stop working? Well, some of the problems you might have is you might need to oil these points in here with clock oil. And that might be the problem. In my case, I believe what the problem was these gears needed to be greased. And I did adjust this at one point, and I think it was binding down. So I undid this screw and this nut here. And when you do that, you can take the motor completely off. I also, at that point, I went ahead and allowed the clock to operate until the bar came forward, took the battery out, and I let the spring wind down all the way, because I believe that the spring was having tension, was being held there, so much tension that it was jamming up the worm gear, and it wouldn't allow it to work, because I could flip it, or when the clock was assembled, here's the case. When the clock was assembled, all I had to do was go like that, and it would take off. So it was getting stuck at that point. So that may help somebody. Again, I think it's just curious how this clock works, and also I like the history of Seth Thomas, and I'd encourage you to go check that out. Well, hope this helps somebody. Thanks for taking the time.